This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 628 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. There's no better time than today to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. This is a limited time offer, so be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week is from @DavidZack16. It's a tweet that says, I have yet to have a full understanding of this concept below. Is it purely a mental phenomenon? And the concept that he's referring to is a tweet that he sent that says, Superflex quarterback valuations are so peculiar. In startup drafts, the running back or wide receiver 10 to 15 go 3+ rounds ahead of some mid to late tier quarterbacks. You can't trade these same running backs and wide receivers for those same quarterbacks in hardly any existing leagues. Why are startup versus entrenched values so different? Look, I think it has everything to do with need. When you trade for a player, it's because you likely need that player, need a player playing that position. And what happens when there's a need? You pay up, you spend. Pretend that you're out in the middle of nowhere and you haven't had water for 24 hours, but you somehow have $100 in your pocket. Now let's pretend someone comes walking by and they have a water bottle. How much money would you be willing to spend on that water bottle? Probably the full $100, right? Because it's a need. This is supply and demand. When you're in a startup draft, you don't feel as though that you have those needs. Everyone's roster is perfect during a draft. Even if you're objectively weak at quarterback, you'll draft guys you think have decent enough outlooks. But those outlooks change. More players enter the league, and that quarterback can be out of a job quick. When that happens, it drives up that need for a quarterback, so you're willing to give up more when you're trading for one. Generally speaking, if you're not drafting with diehard dynasty managers, then quarterbacks will be too cheap in startup drafts. In superflex leagues, that is. And it's because of this idea. It's because when we draft our teams, and this is true for redraft leagues as well, when we draft our teams are perfect. Our teams are fine. Because drafts are happening before football is played. So no one is hurt, no one's struggling, everything is butterflies and rainbows. But once things start to unravel, teams are willing to give up more in order to fix a big problem on their roster. This next question is from @MountainManMT. Does your model include any type of eye test, or is it only based on numbers alone? Every time I see Rachaad White, he seems to flash on tape. However, the numbers may not view him as favorably. So first off, you can get a breakdown of absolutely everything that goes into my model in the Late Round Prospect Guide. You can purchase that guide right now on lateround.com for just $14.99. So if you have any deep curiosity about the model, I'd direct you that way first. The model is all numbers based, but I don't think that means that there's no eye test component to it, because one of the main inputs in the model is draft capital, and draft capital is how a team feels about a player. There's a valuation that occurs within draft capital, and that evaluation is being done by a front office that spends tons and tons of money on evaluating players. I have no problem admitting that I use draft capital. Like, my goal here isn't to predict whether these players are going to get drafted. I'm not a standard scout who's posting my big board based on how I think the draft should go down for teams. I'm not doing mock drafts. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just not what I do. I'm a fantasy analyst. I'm trying to win in fantasy football. There's a very clear goal here. And in order to do that, I want to utilize as much relevant information as possible. And draft capital is very relevant. Now, you bring up Rachaad White, who you say flashes on tape. Rachaad White flashes within my model too. I've talked about this before, but his top comp in my model is David Johnson. The model looks at best season numbers for prospects, and White has really, really strong numbers across the board. In fact, in the model since 2011, there are only 2 other running backs who have a best season reception share of 18%, a best season yards per team play rate of 2.2, and a speed score that's above 90, which is the threshold that I use for weight adjusted 40 time. Rachaad White hit those marks. You want to know who the other 2 running backs that hit those marks were? Christian McCaffrey, Aaron Jones. I'm hoping the NFL likes White as much as the numbers do. I do think that there are some age-related concerns with White that we should not ignore, but he's definitely got a lot of upside. I've moved him to my RB3 pre-draft, but that can easily change if someone like Isaiah Spiller gets better draft capital than I'm currently expecting. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Matt. It says, I always enjoy seeing how current draft prospects stack up in comparison to the last couple of classes. Based on your model, how does, say, Hall stack up to Akers and Dobbins and Burks to Lamb and Waddle? So obviously you can go in a lot of different directions with this, just given that there are a lot of players in this class. But let's talk about the high-end ones and look at the previous 2 classes when doing so. If Breece Hall gets top 40 draft capital, he's going to be in that Najee, Javonte, ETN tier. And it's highly unlikely that Kenneth Walker is able to join him. Walker's going to need to go in the late first round more than likely to hit that 95th percentile mark. That's the mark that elite running backs tend to hit in my model. Whereas Breece has a little bit more room for error because his profile looks better in that model. Walker is probably going to end up being more in that J.K. Dobbins range as a result. Maybe slightly lower, but in that range. And then honestly, the rest of the running backs are going to be all over the place. I have no idea how things are going to go down with them. So I'll wait to talk about the other guys after the draft. Now at wide receiver, I actually updated projected draft capital on Wednesday in my model. And in the model, Drake London is now the wide receiver 1. He was pretty close to Garrett Wilson all offseason, but now their projected draft capital is really close. And the model likes London more objectively. But London and Wilson are in the 97th percentile range. That's really, really good. Across the last 2 classes, Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, and Jerry Jeudy were the only wide receivers able to get there. And if you go to the 95th percentile wide receivers or better, you get those guys along with CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jalen Waddle, Rashad Bateman, and Elijah Moore. So they're in really good company right now. It just depends on where things really end up with the draft. And Chris Olave is actually above the 95th percentile right now as well. He's the model's wide receiver 3 in this class. That's just more evidence that players aren't completely toast when they're not early declares. And then Treylon Burks is next, but he's about 2 percentile spots lower than Chris Olave at this point, mostly due to projected draft capital. I do think these wide receivers are pretty good though. They're not as elite as what we saw with Jamar Chase, but I've got 5 wide receivers with prospect scores in about the 93rd percentile or better range. And this is all off of projected draft capital from sites like grindingthemocks.com. But for context, last year's class also had 5 players above that 93rd percentile mark. They were all better on average than this group of guys, but we still had the same number. And then in 2020, another really good wide receiver class, we had Lamb, Jeudy, and Jefferson. That was it. And then Reagor was right on the fringe. I do think this is a good wide receiver class for fantasy purposes. We've also got a lot of opportunity for early day 2 guys. And then there are players like Sky Moore who could have higher than expected draft capital too. So I'm optimistic. This next question is from Reese from Patreon. It says, hey JJ, given it's dynasty season, do you have any golden rules for dynasty strategy that you use to navigate startup drafts, rookie drafts, trading, etc.? As always, love the pod, the Patreon, and all the work. I'll try to keep this to 3 things. Number 1, understand the structure of your league. I'm not just saying scoring structure either. I mean, if it's a shallow starting lineup, it's easier to go stars and scrubs. If it's a deeper starting roster, you may want to trade back more in order to get super solid depth. Understanding your league structure is unbelievably important. Number 2, be flexible. I generally go with some sort of productive struggle type roster in startups these days, where I'm trying to accumulate as much value as possible to build a powerhouse. But sometimes you have to pivot from your original strategy based on the values that fall to you and the way that others are building in your league. And that's okay. And then number 3 sort of plays into that, but it's to always keep appreciation at the top of your mind. You can build a really nice redraft team in a dynasty startup that's going to compete in year 1. But make sure if you go that direction to at least get a lot of pieces that can still increase in value year over year. One really easy way to do that is to draft running backs with non-premium picks who you know have a shot to be an RB1 or an RB2 in the current season, like Leonard Fournette. And then use your premium picks on wide receivers who are a little bit younger, who you know will at least appreciate in value year over year. So while you have a guy like Fournette that you're relying on with this win now team, you also have a handful of wide receivers who can get better in ADP and overall value year over year, all while still providing production in year one. You don't have to always go productive struggle in startups. I do think it's the best long-term play for reasons I've talked about on the show in the past, like the rewind episode that I did in March on how rookies appreciate in value, but you don't always have to go that direction. If you go with more of a win now approach, just make sure you're still getting assets, probably a wide receiver, that can appreciate in value. Otherwise, you're going to be in a really dark place in just a couple of seasons. This next question is from Clay on Patreon. It says, "Hi JJ, tight end discussion. I know you don't have a tight end model, but seeing Jelani Woods' relative athlete score reminds me that you look for freak athletes at the tight end position. Is Woods the tight end one of this draft class? And if not, can you give us a peek at what you look for in rookie tight ends? Thanks, Clay." So my rankings are all on the late round fantasy football Patreon, and they now include rookies. You can become a patron by going to lateround.com and clicking the link to sign up. But yeah, I love Jelani Woods. I haven't talked about him on this show yet, but I've been on other podcasts the last couple of weeks, and I've brought him up as my go-to tight end. I think Trey McBride is the tight end one in this class, especially considering projected draft capital. But Woods is definitely someone to keep an eye on. He's 6'7", 250 pounds, and he's a height-adjusted speed score in the 94th percentile over on playerprofiler.com. I've done studies in the past showing that breakout tight ends and good fantasy tight ends, they're generally incredibly athletic. And that's exactly what Woods is. I also remember watching him against my alma mater, Pitt. Not sure if you heard, by the way, but Pitt did win the ACC this year. But I remember watching Woods against Pitt this past year and him just looking like this professional athlete against a bunch of high schoolers. He's a massive dude. So I'm really into him. I hope he gets good draft capital to back it all up. Right now, according to Grinding the Mocks, he's the tight end 5 in terms of projected draft capital. The last question this week is from TJ. It says, "Hey JJ, the prospect guide is awesome and I can't wait for the post-draft update. Thanks. I get that draft capital and landing spot will have an influence, but outside of Breece Hall, do you see any running back worth a top 5 rookie pick in a single quarterback league? Hall feels like a given for the 101, but I'm getting the feeling that Wilson, Burks, London, Williams, and maybe Olave would be more worthwhile than Walker or Spiller. Where do you land? Thanks for helping me build my own process." When it comes to higher end players, I worry less about landing spot. Because if the player is good, he's not going to have a hard time getting a starting job. Like, let's just use a hypothetical here. Let's say that Breece Hall goes to the Jets 35th overall in the draft. I'm not predicting that to happen. This is just a hypothetical. That would completely destroy Michael Carter. Hall is a better running back than Michael Carter is. He's a workhorse. Carter likely would go into more of a complementary role, and Hall would still probably be the 101 or close to it in rookie drafts. He'd at least be a top 5 pick, like you're asking. Now let's pretend the Jets don't pick Hall, and they go with Pierre Strong on day 3. We're not going to look at that and say that Strong is going to take over that backfield, even if we like Strong as a prospect, which I do. But it's not really a great backfield for him to go to because Michael Carter's there. There's a player who may be better on that roster. So when it comes to later round picks, which consist of players who aren't as good, landing spot inherently matters more for that immediate opportunity. We want that immediate opportunity so that we can hit on players as soon as possible. And some spots are going to be better than others for that. And some teams will be more open to utilizing a later round pick as rookies, like what we saw in San Francisco with Elijah Mitchell. Early round picks are going to do their thing no matter what, as long as they're good. And yeah, there are some spots that are better than others. Please don't take this the wrong way. Of course, we want a wide receiver to go to Kansas City or Green Bay. And there are some spots that will give you better immediate returns. We just shouldn't drastically shift our views with an early round selection because they're going to get opportunities as long as they are indeed as good as we think at football. I had Kenneth Walker, my RB2, 7th overall in my rankings in my prospect guide. Because if I were drafting before the draft, I wouldn't want to risk playing the draft capital game at running back. And I'd play it safe with a wide receiver bound to go in the first round. I don't mind Walker, but I do think that there is at least a big red flag with his receiving profile coming out of Michigan State. He's not in the same tier, in my opinion, as Breece Hall. If he was, then yeah, he'd be a top 5 pick regardless of landing spot. Because I would assume that he'd have pretty great draft capital all while being a very well-rounded back. Instead, I think he'll get similar enough draft capital to Hall, all while having a worse profile, at least given the stuff that I look at. And for the record, I made a thread on Twitter this week about Kenneth Walker and his receiving profile. I do think that it's a concern. He's still my RB2. He's probably the best pure runner in this class, but it's a concern when looking at fantasy football stuff. The thread talked about his 5.4% best season reception share, which is a really low number. I posted a chart in that thread that split up all running backs drafted outside the first round and in the top 100 who either had an 8% best season reception share or who didn't. And remember, Kenneth Walker is far below that 8% mark. So I'm sort of giving him the benefit of the doubt here. So one column is 17 running backs who didn't hit that 8% best season reception share threshold. And then who were drafted picks 33 to 100. I didn't want first round picks skewing this data. The other column consisted of backs who did hit that 8% reception share threshold. There were 43 of them. Of the running backs who did hit that threshold, that reception share threshold, over 58% of them gave us one season across their first 3 in the league where they scored 12 or more PPR points per game. That number was 47% among the 17 running backs who failed to hit that 8% reception share. So it wasn't totally far off. You get 58% versus 47%. If you look at 14 points per game or better, things start to shift. There's a bigger gap. Of the backs who failed to get an 8% reception share, 11.8% of them were able to give us a season of 14 or more PPR points per game during their first 3 years. That number was almost 40% among the running backs who did get an 8% reception share. And then if you look at 16 points per game, of the running backs who failed to get an 8% reception share, 0 of them, none of them, had a single season during their first 3 years of getting 16 or more PPR points per game. Over 30% of the backs who did get an 8% reception share hit that 16 mark. There's a dramatic difference between the guys who did have a good reception share in college and the guys who didn't in terms of ceiling. Now, when I sent those tweets and I shared that data, there was natural pushback. That data can't tell us that Walker's a bad pass catcher. I don't even disagree with that. Looking at reception share alone cannot tell us that Kenneth Walker is a good or bad pass catcher. What it can tell us is that there's a concern that historically, players with that low of a best season reception share have not gone on to score a lot of fantasy points. That's factual. You can't even debate that. We haven't seen it happen, at least very often. I approach things from the perspective of what's probable, not what's possible. Almost anything is possible. But that doesn't make the data irrelevant. So Walker is my RB2 because I do think he's quite good. He's a really good runner who at the very least should thrive in an early down role in the NFL. But right now, pre-draft, it's really tough for me to have him ahead of some of those first round wide receivers who look really, really good. Or above someone like Breece Hall who has no objective concerns analytically. I think my final tweet in that thread sums up my feeling about Walker best. Talking about his receiving, I said, he's still my RB2 because I'm okay with doing some projecting and having that nuance. He's not my RB1 because there's a prospect who you don't need to do that projecting for in Breece Hall. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Again, check out everything over on lateround.com. Otherwise, have a fantastic weekend.